Kristen nervously fidgeted with the silver heart-shaped pendant, a gift from Ethan on their first anniversary. The cool metal against her skin felt just like the sudden wave of doubt washing over her. Bachelorette party, she repeated to herself, trying to taste the words. They felt like an overly sweet cocktail, fruity and refreshing at first, but with a bitter truth hiding underneath. "Oh, come on, Chris." Katie's sharp, confident voice cut through her thoughts. "You only live once. Ethan won't even notice. All men are the same. Mine, for example, just left on a business trip. Work. Yeah, right." Katie, twice divorced, considered herself an expert on relationships and handed out advice with a cynical ease. Kristen, on the other hand, still believed in fairy tales about eternal love and lifelong loyalty. But today, Katie's words found fertile ground. Lately, Ethan had been working long hours, rarely home, and when he was, he seemed tired and distant. Kristen was feeling lonely and unwanted, and the attention from Max, her charming coworker, was both flattering and exciting. But what if Ethan asks where I was? Kristen still hesitated, though deep down the decision had already been made. "Just tell him we had a girls' night at my lake house," Katie waved dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Pool, sauna, wine, classic. Ethan won't even question it. He trusts you, doesn't he?" Kristen shivered. The word trust felt more like an accusation, but the thrill of the forbidden was too intoxicating to resist. She could already picture Max's arms around her, his whispered words, his touch. The lie slipped from her lips as easily as a sigh. "Bachelorette party," she repeated, and this time it tasted like freedom. The rest of the day felt like a blur. Work slipped through her fingers, her thoughts were scattered, and a strange, dreamy smile played on her lips. Coworkers teased her about being in love, but Kristen just brushed it off, avoiding their eyes. There was some truth in their jokes, not in the way they imagined, but still. Was she in love with Max? Or just in love with the thrill of the forbidden, the rush of escaping her dull routine, the chance to feel desired again? At home, Kristen was even more on edge. Ethan came home late, exhausted and distant. He kissed her absently on the cheek and headed straight to his office. "I've got a conference call." Kristen watched him go, feeling the weight of her deception pressing down on her. She wanted to confess, to spill everything, but the words caught in her throat. Fear of the unknown, of his reaction, kept her silent. Instead, she carefully planned her trip. She called Megan to confirm the cover story, though Megan had no idea about any girls' night. Then she messaged Max, setting up their meeting at a secluded hotel outside the city. With every text, every detail of the plan, anticipation mixed with guilt. Kristen knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop now. The forbidden fruit was too tempting, promising an unforgettable escape. Ethan felt like he was walking on thin ice. Something was off about Kristen. Her forced cheerfulness, her restlessness, the constant hushed phone calls, it all gnawed at him. The bachelorette party story didn't sit right with him either. He knew Megan, his best friend's wife, and couldn't picture her throwing a wild party. And Kristen had never been into that sort of thing. Despite his exhaustion, Ethan couldn't shake his unease. He told himself he was just being paranoid, overthinking because of stress, but his gut told him otherwise. Late Thursday night, while Kristen slept, Ethan picked up her phone. He knew her passcode. They had always been open with each other, or so he thought. Scrolling through her messages, he found a conversation with an unknown number, flirty texts, a scheduled meeting for Friday night at a country hotel. His whole world shattered in an instant. Every suspicion was confirmed. Kristen had been lying. She was planning to cheat. A sharp pain tore through him. Betrayal, anger, heartbreak. The trust they had built was gone, crushed beneath the weight of her deception. Ethan placed the phone back on the nightstand, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness. His mind raced from fury to devastation, from wanting revenge to searching for answers. What had he done wrong? Why would Kristen do this to him? By morning, Ethan had made a decision. He would pretend he knew nothing. Ethan wished Kristen a good day, and left for work. But there was a coldness in his eyes that Kristen, lost in her own thoughts, failed to notice. He had already made up his mind. He was going to follow her. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. He had to see it with his own eyes. Friday felt endless. Ethan struggled to focus at work, his eyes constantly flicking to the clock. He pictured Kristen packing her bag, flashing him a bright smile as she said goodbye, only to drive straight into the arms of her lover. The thought made his stomach turn. He didn't recognize himself anymore. The calm, level-headed Ethan had turned into a hunter tracking his prey. By midday, he left work early, citing a sudden headache. Truthfully, his head was pounding, pulsing from tension and sleepless nights. He got into his car and drove home. Parking a short distance from the building, he waited. Time crawled by in excruciating slow motion. At exactly 6 o'clock, Kristen walked out, right on schedule. She was wearing a new dress, her hair perfectly styled, a small travel bag in hand. She looked excited. Happy. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, forcing himself to stay put, to not jump out of the car and confront her right then and there. Instead, he started the engine and followed the taxi she got into, keeping a safe distance so she wouldn't notice. The road led out of the city. His heart pounded and his mind buzzed with noise. He had no idea what he would do when they arrived. All he knew was that he needed the truth. The need to see it with his own eyes overpowered the fear, the pain. He was ready for anything. The taxi finally stopped at the entrance of a small but charming countryside hotel, not Megan's lake house as Kristen had claimed. Ethan parked nearby, watching as she stepped out, glancing around nervously. He could see her adjusting her hair, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. Even from a distance, he could tell she was anxious. And then Max appeared. He stepped out of the hotel, flashing a wide smile. Kristen hesitated for a split second, then walked toward him. Max wrapped his arms around her and kissed her. Not a polite kiss on the cheek. A real kiss. Deep. Passionate. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. A wave of fury and disgust surged through him as he watched them disappear inside. He sat frozen for a few minutes before getting out of the car. Then he followed. He booked a room on the same floor as theirs, and he waited. Time dragged on. Ethan paced like a caged animal, every second stretching unbearably. Meanwhile, in the next room, Kristen tried to enjoy the moment. Max was charming, attentive, whispering all the words she had longed to hear from Ethan. Compliments, sweet nothings, effortless charm, champagne, a candlelit dinner, the warm glow of dimmed lights. It felt like a scene from a romantic movie. Except Kristen didn't feel like the lead in that movie. Guilt gnawed at her. She couldn't shake Ethan's image from her mind, the exhaustion on his face, the distant way he had kissed her goodbye. Memories flooded back. Their first date, their wedding, the happiness they had once shared. And the more she remembered, the heavier it all felt. Kristen knew she was making a mistake, but she couldn't stop. She felt like a puppet in someone else's hands, blindly following her desires without thinking about the consequences. The masquerade continued. She laughed, flirted, sipped champagne, but there was a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. She kept glancing around, as if afraid someone would see them. Max noticed her nervousness, but mistook it for timid hesitation, which only made him more persistent in his advances. After dinner, they went up to the room. Kristen felt like she was walking a razor's edge. On one side, desire, the urge to escape, to silence her mind, to give in. On the other, guilt, fear. She knew she was betraying Ethan, betraying their love, their family. In the hotel room, Kristen froze for a moment. She thought she heard footsteps outside the door. Her head snapped toward Max. "Did you hear that? Is someone out there?" she whispered, straining to listen. Max chuckled and pulled her into his arms. "You're imagining things. Relax," he murmured, pressing his lips to her neck. But Kristen couldn't relax. The sense of impending disaster wouldn't let go. She felt trapped. The masquerade continued, but the mask was about to fall, revealing the ugly truth. And Kristen dreaded the moment it would happen. Ethan was waiting. Every minute felt like an eternity. He could hear muffled voices from the next room, Kristen's laughter, and it only made the pain worse. His mind filled in the blanks of what was happening behind that door, and rage churned inside him. Then, suddenly, noise in the hallway. Ethan listened. It was Kristen and Max's voices. Judging by their tones, they were talking about something. Ethan stepped closer, pressing his ear to the door. He caught bits and pieces of their conversation. "Wow, it's huge. It won't fit." A long silence followed. Ethan knew they weren't talking about the TV. He took a deep breath. Then, in one swift motion, he pushed open the door. Kristen and Max were in bed. They didn't even have time to grab the sheets. Kristen let out a startled scream and covered her face with her hands. Max froze, speechless. Ethan stood in the doorway like a statue. No anger, no pain, no disappointment, just emptiness. His eyes swept over the room, then landed on Kristen. "Well," he said in a calm, measured voice, "looks like the bachelorette party was a success." Kristen couldn't speak. She shrank under the covers, as if trying to disappear. Max sat up, opening his mouth to say something, but Ethan cut him off. "Don't bother explaining." His voice was still steady, but now it held an icy edge. "I saw everything." He turned and walked out. A few seconds later, he returned, with a fire extinguisher in his hands. Kristen and Max stared at him in horror. "What are you doing?" Max stammered. Ethan didn't answer. He stepped toward the bed, raised the nozzle, and pressed the lever. A powerful blast of white foam erupted, covering them from head to toe. They shrieked, shielding themselves, but it was too late. The room filled with thick, sticky foam. Ethan emptied the extinguisher, then tossed it to the floor and walked out without another word. He didn't feel triumph, only exhaustion, only a crushing emptiness. He had his answers, but they didn't make him feel better. If anything, the pain in his chest was worse. Ethan got home late that night. He didn't turn on the lights, just walked into the bedroom and started packing Kristen's things. Dresses, blouses, shoes, neatly folded into large suitcases. Methodical, silent, robotic. No rage, no regret, just a cold, calculated resolve. When he was done, he sent her a short message. "Your stuff is by the door. Leave the keys in the mailbox." Then he turned off his phone and lay down, staring at the ceiling. Awake until morning. Kristen came home at dawn. She looked broken, lost. The fire extinguisher foam had dried on her clothes, leaving behind white streaks like a mark of shame. When she saw the suitcases by the door, she understood everything. Ethan knew. She tried calling him, but his phone was off. Then she started knocking, softly at first, then harder and harder. But Ethan didn't open the door. He lay in bed, listening to her desperate pleas, feeling something inside him die. The last bit of warmth, the last hope that this was just a nightmare, gone. Kristen sat outside his door until morning. Then, finally, she picked up her suitcases and left, dropping her keys in the mailbox. She had no idea where she was going, what she would do next. Her world had collapsed, and she had no clue how to rebuild it. Reality crashed down on her like ice water, washing away every illusion, leaving behind nothing but emptiness and pain. Days blurred into an endless nightmare. Kristen stayed with Katie, sleeping on a pull-out cot, eating whatever she could find. She called Ethan constantly, sent messages, begged for forgiveness, but he never answered. His silence was worse than any words. It told her that he would never forgive her. At first, Katie felt sorry for her, but soon, her patience started to wear thin. Her tiny apartment wasn't meant for two people, and Kristen's constant tears were getting on her nerves. "Enough already," Katie snapped one night. "What's done is done. Move on. You'll find someone else." But Kristen didn't want someone else. She wanted Ethan. She wanted her old life back. She knew this was all her fault, She had destroyed their happiness, and the thought was unbearable. She tried to see him, waited outside his office, left notes at his door. But he avoided her like the plague. Reality kept crashing down, forcing her to face the depth of her own downfall. She had lost everything: her husband, her home, her self-respect, and now she had to learn how to live with the weight of guilt and regret. Weeks turned into months. Kristen rented a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town and took a low-paying job. She avoided former coworkers, old friends. Ashamed of what she had done, her life became dull, gray. But she didn't give up. She kept writing to Ethan, occasionally waiting for him outside his home or work. Every time he walked past without a word, without even looking at her, his silent contempt was the worst punishment of all. One day, Kristen decided to take drastic measures. She went to Ethan's office and waited in the lobby. When he walked out, she ran to him, pleading, "Ethan, please, just let me explain." Her voice shook, her eyes filled with tears. "I know I messed up, but I regret everything. I love you." Ethan stopped. He looked at her. His eyes were cold, empty. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, voice steady, clear. "It's over." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Kristen standing there, heart shattered. She finally understood. Ethan wasn't coming back. He had erased her from his life, like a bad memory. Despair crashed over her in waves. She wandered through the streets, blind to everything around her. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. The world felt cold and hostile, just like Ethan's gaze. Fragments of memories swirled in her mind. Their laughter, their whispered, "I love yous," the warmth of his touch. All of it felt so distant now, unreal. Kristen couldn't believe she had thrown it all away. She tried to blame Katie, Max, the circumstances. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was her. She had made the choice. She had betrayed Ethan's love. Kristen knew she should let him go, give him the chance to move on, but she couldn't. Her love for him, tangled with guilt and desperation, tightened around her heart like a vice. She was an addict who couldn't quit, even knowing it was destroying her. The game of cat and mouse continued. Kristen chased Ethan, and Ethan ran from her, like she was his own shadow. And every time she saw his cold, distant stare, Kristen felt the emptiness inside her grow. She was losing. Not just this battle. She was losing herself. Ethan had been silent for a long time. He carried the pain of her betrayal like a splinter, buried deep in his heart. At first, his anger was aimed at Kristen, her lies, her deceit. But gradually, that anger turned into something else. A bitter realization of his own blindness, his own naivety. He felt like a fool, like a joke, just another clueless guy, the kind they mocked on internet forums he had started reading after the affair. He saw how Kristen tried to win him back, how she humiliated herself, begged for forgiveness. But he felt nothing, no pity, no desire to forgive. The trust was shattered beyond repair. And more than that, Ethan realized he didn't even want to forgive. He wanted payback. He wanted Kristen to feel the same kind of pain she had inflicted on him. So he decided to strike back. Hard. Ethan didn't keep her affair a secret. He made sure everyone knew. Their mutual friends, their families, their coworkers. He didn't sugarcoat the story. He didn't hide his own pain, his humiliation. He exposed Kristen completely, making sure her betrayal wasn't just a private sin, it was public. He wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to understand that betrayals don't just fade away, they come with a price. This was his revenge, cold, calculated, and final. If people were going to call him a fool, then fine. He would own it, but he'd do it on his terms. The reactions were mixed. Some sided with Ethan, condemning Kristen. Some tried to comfort him, urging him to forgive and move on. And some, even knowing what she had done, defended Kristen, accusing Ethan of being cruel. But he didn't care. He had achieved what he wanted. Kristen had been exposed. Her reputation was in ruins. Friends turned their backs on her. Coworkers stopped talking to her. Even Katie, who had supported her at first, backed away, afraid of the public fallout. Kristen was alone, left to face her shame. She tried to explain, to justify what she had done, but no one listened. The words stuck in her throat. Her mind buzzed with noise. She felt like she had been stripped bare, paraded in front of a crowd, turned into the main character of a scandal she couldn't escape. Ethan's revenge had landed. She felt it, and for the first time, she truly understood. Betrayal doesn't disappear. It leaves deep wounds, ones that may never heal. And now, she would have to live with the stain of what she had done. Ethan, on the other hand, felt lighter. He had carried the weight of her betrayal long enough, but now he had turned it into a weapon. Kristen's world crumbled. Gossip wrapped around her like poison ivy, creeping into every corner of her life. She became an outcast, the punchline of whispers and smirks. Coworkers turned away, whispering behind her back. Friends, people who had once called her their best friend, vanished. Even Katie stopped answering her calls. Then she lost her job. Her boss, unwilling to deal with the scandal, urged her to resign. Finding new work proved nearly impossible. No one wanted to hire a woman whose name was attached to this kind of mess. Loneliness closed in, cold and unrelenting. Kristen wandered empty streets, feeling completely lost. The world, once full of color, had turned gray and lifeless. One illusion after another shattered around her. And in the end, she understood. She had done this to herself. She had destroyed her own life, pushed away the people who had truly loved her. And that realization, that was the hardest blow of all. The apartment she had rented now felt foreign, cold, like it belonged to someone else. The walls felt like they were closing in. The silence rang in her ears. Kristen spent hours sitting by the window, watching strangers pass by, envying their simple, ordinary lives. It felt like she had lost her right to happiness forever. Nights were the worst. The nightmares tormented her. Visions of Ethan, his eyes filled with pain, his voice full of accusations. She would wake up drenched in cold sweat, a scream frozen on her lips. During the day, she tried to distract herself, but nothing helped. Books sat unread. Movies felt empty. Music had lost its joy. Food tasted like nothing. Sleep brought no relief. Kristen realized she had hit rock bottom. She had lost everything that once mattered. And now, standing in the wreckage of her own life, she finally grasped the full weight of what she had done. Her illusions had shattered completely. Irreversibly. All that remained was herself, her pain, her guilt, her bitter regret, and she had no choice but to live with it. The court summons arrived unexpectedly. Kristen hadn't expected to hear anything from Ethan anymore. His silence had felt like the final verdict. But now, this paper in her hands reopened the wound. Ethan was filing for divorce. She knew it was inevitable, but still, seeing it in black and white hit her like lightning out of a clear sky. She held the summons tightly, reading the words over and over, struggling to believe it was real. Their love story, the one she had once thought was unbreakable, eternal, was officially ending. Memories flooded back, their wedding day, the smiling faces of family and friends, the vows they had exchanged, swearing loyalty and love. Now, all of it felt distant, unreal, like something from another lifetime. Desperate for one last chance, Kristen called Ethan, hoping for a conversation, a way to fix things. But his voice was like ice. "Don't call me again," he said. Then he hung up, and that was it. Kristen understood. This was the end. She had lost everything. Love, family, home, friends, respect. The price of betrayal had been too high, and now she had to pay in full. On the day of the hearing, Kristen felt like she was in a dream. She walked through the courthouse halls, faces blurring around her, voices muffled. None of it felt real. Then, in the courtroom, she saw Ethan. He was calm, collected, like this was just another ordinary task to check off a list. There was no anger in his eyes, no pain, just cold indifference. And that indifference cut deeper than any knife. The process was quick, formal. The judge read the decision, and just like that, it was over. Kristen and Ethan were no longer husband and wife. They were strangers. Walking out of the courthouse, Kristen paused on the steps, taking in the crisp air. The world around her felt sharp, too bright, like she was seeing it for the first time. But in that brightness, there was no joy, only emptiness. She understood now. There was no going back. She had paid the price for her betrayal, and now she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. She had lost everything, and it was her own fault. It was a bitter truth, but a necessary one. Now, she had to learn how to live again, to rebuild from nothing. No Ethan, no past, no illusions. Time moved forward, but the wounds in Kristen's soul refused to heal. Loneliness became her constant companion. She often thought of Ethan, of their life together, and each time her heart ached with regret. She tried to start over. She found a job, not much, but stable. She moved to a different part of the city hoping to avoid familiar faces, reminders of the past. But the past never truly let go. Guilt followed her everywhere, whispering in the back of her mind. She had made an irreversible mistake. She had destroyed her own family. She had betrayed the man who had loved her. And living with that knowledge, that was her real punishment. Kristen often imagined how different life would have been if she had made another choice. If she hadn't given in to a fleeting temptation, if she hadn't thrown everything away. But there was no rewinding time, no undoing the damage. She had to live with the consequences. Meanwhile, Ethan was truly moving on. The pain of betrayal slowly faded, making room for other emotions. Ethan buried himself in work, traveled often, and spent time with friends. He made a conscious effort not to think about Kristen, to erase her from his memory. One evening, while grabbing coffee at a cafe, he unexpectedly ran into Anna, an old acquaintance. They started talking, and to his surprise, he found himself enjoying the conversation. Anna was smart, kind, and beautiful. She knew nothing about his past, and he saw no reason to bring up his pain. As time passed, their connection deepened into something more. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt his heart thawing, as if winter was finally giving way to spring. Kristen's betrayal was still a scar on his soul, but it no longer controlled him. Meanwhile, Kristen remained alone. Bitter regret became her constant companion. She knew she had lost Ethan forever, lost her chance at happiness. And that realization was the steepest price of all. Life moved forward, but for Kristen, it felt like an endless journey through a wasteland of loneliness, with only the voice of her own conscience reminding her of what she had done. And with that, the story comes to an end. Thank you all for your support. Let me know if you enjoyed this story.